great warrior Achilles, stunningly handsome. But in the morning, when she goes to get married, she can't understand why her father's standing at the altar up there, along with her soon-to-be husband, Achilles, standing up there, along with the great warrior Odysseus standing up there at the altar, won't look at her. But she believes in her dad, so she walks up there to the altar. When she arrives at the altar, she figures she's about to get married. Daddy grabs her, puts her on the altar, takes out this huge knife and whoo, right down through her heart. Stabs his own daughter to death as sacrifice to Artemis. The wind stopped blowing. Everybody runs down, gets on a ship, and sails for Troy. Let's put a note there and a star next to the note. Mamas have a tendency to not forget when you jack around with their daughters, yes? And so there will be a homecoming of Agamemnon, and it will not be a pretty homecoming of Agamemnon. We'll get to it. After the sacrifice of Iphigenia, we then have the landing at Troy. This is an interesting little story. Protesilaus is a great Greek warrior. There has been a rumor that the first person who steps off a boat at the walls of Troy will immediately die. And sure enough, Protesilaus does immediately die. The Greeks honor their dead, this hero, right away. Down into the underworld, Hermes goes and brings Protesilaus back so that he can be face to face with his wife one last time. His wife is so brokenhearted, she will commit suicide and die because she wants to be with her man in the underworld. This will be a motif that we will see repeated a number of times, which is why we're pointing it out. Well, you got 1,000 ships. They all land at the walls of Troy. And right away, you've got the two great warriors going at it. For the Trojans, let's write it down, the greatest warrior is Hector. Hector, the horse tamer. And of course, for the Greeks, it is Achilles. They're great warriors. And Edith Hamilton points out that the whole time they're at the walls of Troy, they know they are fighting under the shadow of death. It's just a matter of time. For 9 years, they will fight. And nothing happens. We cannot, if we're Greeks, get into the walls of Troy. We cannot, if we're Trojans, defeat the Greeks. So you have kind of a standoff at the end of 9 years. Immediately we have some interesting things that happen. Agamemnon has taken a girl as a prize. Her name is Chryses. She is the daughter of the god Apollo's priest for the Trojans. And immediately, men start dying. Why? Apollo is mad. He's shooting arrows down from Mount Olympus into all of the Greek troops, and soon they will all die. It is the prophet Achilles who will say, what's going on? You've got to give back Chryses. Achilles, in fact, will tell Agamemnon, you got to give back the girl. Agamemnon says, I am not giving back the girl unless I can have your prize, Achilles, the girl you got from a battle named Chryses. Achilles is like, no, that ain't how it works. The way it works is, I got my girl, you got the wrong girl. Agamemnon pulls rank. This is important for your notes. He gives back Chryses, but he takes Agamemnon's girl, Chryses. And in the process, Achilles decides to leave the war. He won't fight anymore. He goes to his tent and he sits and he pouts. They took his girl. He isn't going to fight anymore. Okay? There he sits with his best friend Patroclus, and he refuses to fight. Achilles' mom Thetis is a sea nymph. She goes to Zeus and she says to Zeus, you're going to have to pick a side. I want you to make sure that these Trojans take care of their business because of what the Greeks did to my son in embarrassing him. Now this is an interesting moment. Let's put it in our notes. In the Troy tale, we actually have two different wars. We have the war of the Greeks against the Trojans, but we have the war of the gods against each other. In other words, we actually have gods choosing sides. And in fact, in our story, several times, gods fighting against gods, which seems kind of ludicrous, right? But it's the way it works. Let's outline it really quickly. supporting the Trojans, obviously Aphrodite, she was chosen by Paris, but also Ares, god of war, Apollo, of course, also, and Artemis. All of them will support, for the most part, the Trojans. The Greeks are, of course, supported, no big shock here, by Hera and by Athena, but also by Poseidon, okay, the god of the sea. And that's a major one, because Poseidon is the one that made sure that they all get to the shores of Troy. In the middle sits Zeus. He prefers the Trojans, but he tries to stay neutral as much as possible. Okay? Zeus sends a false dream to Agamemnon. He says, tomorrow you will win if you go and fight. The great battle will begin to ensue. There is a battle in which Helen is going to stand on the walls of Troy. Remember, we're all fighting because of Helen. And she starts naming all of the different Greek warriors that she sees, because of course she grew up Greek. She knows all of these great warriors. Finally, Paris and Menelaus come face to face, and both sides decide that it makes sense to let the two of these face off. Whoever wins gets Helen, and the war is over. Menelaus is very happy for this arrangement. Paris, who is a lover and no fighter, which is why when the city of love gets named, it doesn't get named Menelaus or Agamemnon or Achilles. The great city of love gets named Paris. Paris, who's a lover and no fighter, says, I ain't interested in fighting, and yet he has to. He would have been killed by Menelaus, but Aphrodite sweeps down and saves Paris. Of course, because she does this, Agamemnon will make the argument to the Trojans, clearly Menelaus won this fight, clearly we deserve to have Helen back, clearly let's call it the end of the war. We are at the end of 9 years. It's been a long battle, right? All of the Trojans are in agreement. However, well, we can't quite do it because of Hera's rage. She still is upset. She wants to see all of the Trojans die, and so she will whisper in the ear of a great Trojan warrior, Pandarus, and Pandarus will shoot an arrow at Menelaus, wounding him, grazing him, and immediately the battle is back on again. On the Greek side, we have two great warriors for your notes, Ajax and Diomedes. Diomedes almost kills Aeneas, one of the great Trojan warriors. Aphrodite is wounded in the process, and Artemis has to help to be able to save Aeneas. Now that will be significant because Aeneas will factor heavily at the very end of our telling of the Troy tale. Diomedes actually is such a great mighty warrior that he is so amazing in his fighting. He actually wounds the god Ares, the god of war, and Ares will go back to Mount Olympus crying and complaining that he got hurt, and he will get no love there because, as we've said in earlier lectures, none of the gods like Ares, this god of war. The Trojans ultimately, however, have to fall back. Here we've got an interesting moment. Hecuba, the queen of Troy, will pray to Athena and will present a precious robe, and she will say, please help us to win and make these Greeks go away. And Athena will say, no. Remember, Athena didn't get the golden apple, right? We then have an interesting moment between Hector, the great warrior, and his wife, Andromache. And Andromache, as well as Astyanax, his son, they will beg Hector not to fight. But Hector will say, I am a man, I am a Trojan, I must fight even though I must die. And he has his final words. Zeus has had enough, and he orders all gods to heaven, and he goes down to help the Trojans. Hector, the great tamer of horses, the great warrior, will drive the Greeks all the way to their ships, and he's ready to start setting those ships on fire. Remember, all the ships are made of wood, yes? Agamemnon finally will say it. I think I'm done. And he says to Nestor, I think it's time for us to just give this fight up and leave. It's Nestor who will say to Agamemnon, look, the only reason you're losing this fight is because Achilles isn't fighting. He's mad at you. Give back Achilles the girl, Briseis. Give him a whole bunch of money, and he'll go back into the war and he'll fight. You'll remember, Achilles is sitting in his tent along with his best pal Patroclus. Odysseus is sent, along with Briseis, and the gifts to give to Achilles, and Achilles says, no go. You've offended me, you've hurt my pride, I got no interest in fighting. It's at this point we have a very interesting side note story. Hera, who of course wants to see all of the Trojans dead, realizes that Zeus is kind of keeping it from happening. So she dresses up in her best gear to look the most stunningly beautiful that she can, and she seduces Zeus and puts him to sleep so he forgets his promise to Theseus that he will support the Trojans. It's at this point the Greeks begin to win. Ajax almost kills Hector. Hector ultimately saved by Aeneas, his brother. Zeus wakes up. He's really mad at Hera. In fact, he says, I should give you a good beating for this, making me go to sleep and not paying attention to what's going on. Let's just point out the anthropomorphic nature, as we've said in earlier lectures about these gods. They behave like spoiled children sometimes, right? Hera will say, hey, it wasn't my fault, it was Poseidon who was helping the Greeks. So Zeus will send Ino, the rainbow messenger, Hamilton calls her, and Zeus will tell Poseidon in no uncertain terms, you got to withdraw, I can't have you fighting on the side of the Greeks. Apollo then will help Hector. He will rout the Greeks, and he's ready to set the ships on fire. It's at this moment Patroclus looks up. This will be a pivotal moment in our story. Patroclus looks up and he sees Hector is winning. He says to his pal Achilles, I have got to do something if you won't. Give me your armor, he says to Achilles. I will put it on. When I step out into the battle, the Greeks will believe you have returned and they will take heart. The Trojans will believe you have returned and they will run away. And in the process, we can save our ships from all being burned up. Achilles says, no worries, but when you step out into that war, promise me that you won't chase the Trojans because they're going to run. And Patroclus says, yeah, sure. But when he gets into the war and he goes, I'm Achilles and I'm back, and they all run, he can't help himself and he runs after the Trojans. Now he's in the battlefield. He fights well. But at one moment, he finally comes face to face with Hector, and it does not take Hector long to kill who he thinks is Achilles. When he takes off the helmet and realizes that it's not Achilles, he does two terrible things. He will take the armor of Achilles and put it on himself. And secondly, he will disgrace the body of Patroclus. Well, Achilles, the Iliad actually begins with the lines, sing, O goddess of the rage of Achilles. Achilles is a guy who, kind of like Hercules, we talked about in a prior lecture, Achilles is a guy who has a tremendous rage issue, and when Patroclus comes back dead, and the armor that was his armor given to Patroclus is being worn by Hector, it's only a matter now of time for Achilles to say, I'm ready to enter the war. And sure enough, it's actually ready. It's ready for that to happen, right? Achilles, however, has an issue, right? The first thing is we've got to make sure Achilles has some kind of armor, right? And so Theseus will in fact make sure that Hephaestus will make new armor. Right? And so that way when Achilles wakes up the next morning, he's got armor, he's ready to go to war, and he's got the best of all imaginable armor. Achilles is ready to fight. Odysseus is ready to eat. Odysseus says, oh, seriously? You've been sitting out of this battle for all these months, and now all of a sudden you're ready to jump back into the war. Our men have to eat first. Let's make a point here in your notes. The Troy tale makes a clear distinction between two different kinds of heroes. Achilles, he's that fighter type. He's scrapper. He's ready to go at it with his brawn and his muscle. Kind of like Hercules in that regard. Odysseus is more wily. That's often the translated word. It means crafty. It means tricky. In other words, Odysseus is the kind of guy who will always have a plan. Achilles is the kind of guy, if he doesn't like you, he'll say, hey, let's fight right now and I'm going to jack you right to your face. Odysseus is the kind of guy that says, hey, I'm your pal, let's go for a drive in the Badlands. And when you ask him why he's got a shovel in the back of his pickup, he'll say, no, don't worry about it. That's Odysseus. In other words, Odysseus is going to jack you, but he's not going to do it the way Achilles does often. He's going to do it kind of sly. And Odysseus is the thinker, and Odysseus says, look, you're going to expect all these men to go fight, and they're hungry. So let's feed them first, and then we'll go to war. Achilles will have none of it. He says, I will not eat again until I've avenged the death of my pal Patroclus. And of course, that will then be the next part of our story. This is the final meeting between Achilles and Hector, and a couple of important things. First of all, Zeus has these golden scales. For those of you that have studied with me in the Milton's Paradise Lost, you know about these scales, right? These scales where it's all weighed, right? And in the end, Zeus has to say it. Hector will die. Achilles will win. We have terrible fighting now that will ensue. The river Scamander actually tries to kill Achilles, but he's able to fight against the river. The gods begin to fight. Zeus watches and actually laughs about the whole thing as kind of silly. And then finally Achilles comes face to face with Hector. Hector will run from Achilles 3 times, but finally he decides to be brave, courageous, and he will turn and he will fight. Athena will appear as the brother of Hector, right? Deiphobus, and she will kind of let Hector believe that he's got a second there to kind of help him. This will, of course, be the final chance for Hector. Hector is interested, if he dies, in making sure that there's a truce between Achilles and himself. Return my body to the king of Troy, Priam. Achilles' comment is, no. Last thing you're going to see is my boot coming down on your eye socket after I jack you. There can be no covenant, no agreement between sheep and wolves, he says. Well, Hector is finally fooled by Athena. He turns. He thinks that, in fact, his bro is standing there to hand him a sword. His bro is gone. And it's at that moment Hector realizes that the gods are against him and Athena has ruined him. Achilles looks up and recognizes that Hector is wearing the very armor that Achilles has worn. And Achilles knows that the weakness is near the throat area, and it doesn't take much for Achilles to kill Hector. When Hector is dying, his last words are, please return my body to my father Priam. And Achilles will have none of it. He does several things. He will take the body of Hector and drag it around the battlefield. He will do nasties to the body with dogs biting on it. And then he takes the body back to his camp, and he's going to let the body rot. In other words, not proper burial. This is a big deal as part of the fighting. On Mount Olympus, there is a bit of dissension about all of this, because you're not supposed to abuse dead bodies, right? Zeus is mad. He sends Iris to Priam, the king of Troy, and says, go to Achilles with the help of Hermes and request the body of your son. When Priam shows up, this is a pivotal moment at the conclusion of the Iliad. It's simple. All Achilles has to do is draw his sword, kill the old man, the king of Troy, and this entire battle is done and over with. But he can't do it. Achilles recognizes in the begging tears of the old man a certain kind of pathos or empathy. And he returns the body of Hector, and he allows 9 days of mourning when there will be no fighting of any kind. And there's a funeral pyre for Hector, and there's a funeral pyre for Patroclus, and the ashes are put in an urn, and this is the end of the Iliad. Okay? So put a note to yourself that this is the conclusion of the stories of the Iliad. Let's do some quick 2 and 3 level work. At level 2A, possible messages. Well, we could jot down this one, the importance of courage in the face of death. Hector knows he's going to die. He even runs at first, but then he decides to kind of man up and do it. At 2B, we'll concentrate in our whole lecture here on conflict at 2B. Think about all the different kinds of fighting and violence that goes on, right? You have men fighting against men. You have gods fighting against gods. Of course, you have men fighting against women and its reverse. You have all different kinds of violence. Can we list several? Think about this. Obviously, we have physical violence, no doubt. But think about the other kinds of violence that occur in this story to this point. Linguistic violence, the fighting with words, for example, that goes on, the taunting, the linguistic challenges that are always a part of this text. You have, of course, psychological violence. Why would you take a dead body and pull it around all over the battlefield and let dogs chomp on it? It's not like the body's going to feel anything. That ain't got nothing to do with the body that's dead. It obviously has to do with what your message you're trying to send to the rest of the people. That's psychological violence, right? Of course, think of it as well. We have emotional violence, right? You could probably come up with a number of others. We have environmental violence of a kind, right? The river fighting against Achilles and the like. At 3a, relationship to other texts. Well, obviously we're going to say it, the Iliad is a text that you want to read for sure, right? There's a lot of movies that have been made of this, right? You probably are familiar maybe with Brad Pitt's film Troy. There's a lot of films that have been made and movies that have been made of this storyline. You can think maybe about your favorite video game. Jot that one down. What for you is your favorite video game that kind of brings to mind some of the stories that we've just told? And then finally at 3b, how you relate this to yourself. What was a time that you knew you would lose and you had to fight anyway? Think about that. Ball players love this question, right? A time, for example, you were competing against an opponent that you knew you just couldn't win, and yet you went out and you had to do it anyway, right? I once had a wrestler who I taught who said, totally know this one, because at state, I knew I had to go up against a guy who had never lost, and there was no real likelihood I could beat him. And yet I had to step out onto the mat, and I took him to the third round. I'm very proud of the fact that he didn't pin me. I lost the points, but he didn't pin me. But I knew all the while there was really no chance I could win, and yet I had to go out and I had to compete as if I would. He said, I kind of understand where Hector's at on that count. Of course, that's always been one of the debates of the Troy tale, is who do you see as more heroic? Achilles, who goes to the tent and pouts for most of the storyline, or Hector, who goes out into the war again and again and again, risking his life to fight, right? You can kind of decide. All right, we turn now to chapter 14. This is a brief chapter, but it's an important one. This is the fall of Troy, so put that one in your notes. The fall of Troy. All right? I'm actually going to share just a few lines with you. This is the introduction that Edith Hamilton will give. It's such beautiful prose that I feel like I want to share it with you. She says it this way. The greater part of this story, the fall of Troy, comes from Virgil, the great Roman poet. The capture of Troy is the subject of the